Okay, everybody, welcome to today's Q-MARE seminar. This is our 13th and actually final seminar. And so because it's our final, before we hear from John Pandolfi, today's speaker, I just want to take the time to thank everybody that's given a seminar on our seminar series. We've had 13 with John's seminars from some really fantastic scientists and really interesting topics that have kind of addressed the questions that was set up by the working group, the Q-MARE working group, which is essentially to bring better insights into understanding historical, archaeological, paleontological changes and how they can offer, what sort of insights they can offer into the complexity and of changes through time and over space in natural and human-induced ecosystems, both terrestrial and marine. And so it's been a real pleasure to be able to host the people that I wanted to invite. So I want to thank everybody for participating and also everyone that gave a talk. It was really great. Okay, so today's speaker is John Pandolfi. It's a real pleasure to invite you, John. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us your time. John is, just really quickly, John, if you don't know John, where have you been? John is a powerhouse really in the field of historical ecology, especially on coral reefs, I would say. And he's led some of the most, I would say, important works uncovering the dynamics of coral reef ecosystems over time, and really shaping the way we think about baselines, shifting baselines, how coral reefs have changed, and what that means for the context of global climate change and human interactions with reefs into the future. John is currently professor at marine biology at the University of Queensland. And before that, he held positions actually at the Smithsonian, and also in Panama at SCRI, where I am now. And, you know, John's research is really, you know, focused on high diversity ecosystems and the interactions of those natural ecosystems, beautiful ecosystems of coral reefs with humans and where we're going in the future. And today, John is going to be talking about a new topic that he's been delving into on detecting and interpreting novel ecosystems. It's a novel question for novel ecosystems. So thank you, John. It's an honor to have you here. I'll hand it over to you. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks, Aaron, very much for those kind words. Let's see if I can get this thing going. Oh yeah, I think you can see my screen now.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Aaron, and thanks to organizing the series of Q-MARE talks. They've been a wonderful series of talks. It was a great idea, and maybe it'll continue into the future. Today, I'm just going to talk a bit about something that's struck my fancy over the last couple of years. It all stemmed from a question I asked myself and Wolfgang Kiesling back in 2012, and that is, what if we dropped into the Miocene, and we had a time capsule, and we dropped into the Miocene and some community there, either on land or in the sea, and we're tasked with the question of, is this a novel community? How would we know? So I started thinking about that. Wolfgang and I started thinking about that over the next several years. And it wasn't until we developed a sort of a framework to try to understand novelty that we were able to actually maybe address some of those interesting questions. So I'll try to give you some insight into that today. So as you all know, this wonderful graphic from Macaulay shows is that biotic communities in both terrestrial and marine habitats are undergoing dramatic changes globally, from both local pressures distributed globally and from global environmental change. These changes have been occurring for a very long time. Habitat degradation, anthropogenic exploitation, species invasions, pollution and climate change, and even novel climates. And more often than not, these changes involve shifting configurations of species and communities, leading to novel ecological communities or ecological novelties, communities with no real precedence in the past history of that particular ecosystem. One of the results of this human alteration that was shown very nicely by Maria Dornalis et al. Sorry, in 2014, I don't have her cited here, but this is from Maria's paper. Beta diversity shown on the right, or taxonomic turnover, has increased through time. So taxonomic turnover is getting more and more common and accelerating. Whereas local taxonomic richness, shown on the left here, has remained constant. But it's this increasing taxonomic turnover that has resulted in what we are beginning to recognize as novel ecological communities. So it's those that I want to focus on today. Well, we have to start out with definitions. I'm afraid I'm going to plague you with definitions throughout at least the beginning of the talk. But to give you some kind of historical context, what are novel ecosystems? Well, probably the concept of a novel community and novel ecosystems has been received a lot of attention for a large part from this book edited by Richard Hobbs et al. In 2013. And in that particular book, which was devoted or targeted mostly to conservation biologists, the conservation biologist idea of a novel ecosystem are those in which historically unprecedented combinations of species occur, primarily as a result of human influences. So the idea of a change or a new community or a new ecosystem was placed in the prism of human influences. Now you can see that this is a little bit different from my question about flying into the Miocene. The notion that these authors put forward is that novel ecosystems are heavily entwined with restoration and with linked social ecological systems. But in practice, novel communities have been difficult to identify through a lack of robust, repeatable, and quantitative framework. And while there was a lot of discussion in this book, really important discussion, the putting forward a quantitative and repeatable framework to ensure that one person's novelty is also another person's novelty was not really addressed. And because of that, it's been difficult to provide comparative ecosystem analysis. So how does a coral novelty in coral reef differ from novelty in polar ecosystems, for example? Parallel with this has been work that's been done by the plant paleoecologists. And what they have been doing for many years is looking at what they call no analog communities. And no analog communities are compositionally unlike any found today. So typically the plant paleoecologists go into the past, try to understand community composition, and then compare it with today and see if there are analogs in the modern. This has led to a number of well-developed quantitative methods, but usually the modern was the only reference point. So, when I fly into the Miocene, I don't have the modern. I've only got the Miocene and before the Miocene. So this is okay as far as it goes, and has been very useful in understanding quaternary history of plant communities. But there's been little focus on how different various community states were to each other in the past, because of this comparison between the past and the modern. So in my talk today, I'm going to present to you a new high-level conceptual framework that unifies the past and potential future approaches to the detection, analysis, and application of ecological novelty. They're based on 5 quantifiable universal components, which I'll go into. Then I'll discuss some studies that apply some aspects of this framework, and then suggest some potential applications to marine and other ecosystems. Before we get into that, just a slight commercial here, a word on anomaly detection. You have to remember that ecosystem novelty or novel communities, this is a subdiscipline of a much larger endeavor of academic inquiry that investigates anomaly detection. Anomaly detection is a very broad and mature research field that is developing techniques to detect anomalies. And so what we do in trying to understand and detect novelty falls under this rubric of anomaly detection. These techniques are applied to complex fields such as banking fraud, cybersecurity, video surveillance, information science, and even cancer detection. And so what my postdoc here, Dr. Tim Staples, is doing is he's trying to use some of these techniques in these other fields to apply to ecological data. And that's the subject of some of Tim's current research right now. So just to place this ecological novelty detection in a broader framework for the moment. Okay, enough of that. So let's have a look first at the general framework we've recently developed. The framework is the result of a workshop convened by myself and Tim Staples, who I just spoke about, a picture of that there. And we brought together an international group of ecologists and paleoecologists from marine and terrestrial settings. Aaron was part of that group. Thank you, Aaron. And many of the plant paleoecologists, Jack Williams, Volker Radloff, and others, and some Tina Hager working on novelty in modern ecosystems, and a whole group of people. We sat down and said, okay, well, what is novelty? How can we detect it? What are the formal components of novelty? And basically, before we get into that sort of formal framework, we just want to have a couple of definitions: novelty versus novelty. So novelty can be measured as the degree of difference in a group of predefined dimensions between a target and a reference set. In general, the target is a community today, and the reference set is those communities that have preceded it. Now, a target with novelty exceeding a threshold that represent profound or anomalous change is then termed novel. So we can measure novelty, but it isn't until that measurement of novelty is placed in context that we can begin to identify actual novel communities, okay? So what are these 5 universal components that are encompassed in this diagram? Well, the first thing is that we have to have a target, an observation at an entity of interest, like a community at a particular time period in a particular place. A reference set is a set of observations from a group of entities used to compare to the target. So we don't know whether the target is novel or not without reference to some set of other entities. The degree of difference is measured, which gives an understanding of novelty, right? How we're measuring novelty. Quite often this is a Bray-Curtis dissimilarity index or some other of 20 or 30 or 40 other dissimilarity indices that you might want to apply in a particular situation. The fourth component is one or more dimensions that are predefined, and they're used to measure the novelty between the target entity and the reference set. So that's a lot of mumbo jumbo that states, what is it that we're looking at? Is it species abundances? Is it climate variables? You can measure novelty anywhere on anything if you like. So the dimensions provide the context for the study. And then we need a threshold to classify how large the measurements need to be considered novel. How dissimilar is your target community from your reference communities, and I'll show you what we do to come up with these thresholds. Okay, so here's how it might work for a measure of novelty for a target community. You compare that target community to a reference set. So for example, You can have a 2023 coral reef community. Aaron mentioned I like coral reef, so we'll stick with that. To those measured previously at the same site along a time series. So this reference set might be a time series of communities prior to 2023, maybe every 5 years since 1990 or something like that. We use a Bray-Curtis index as a degree of difference across a predefined group of dimensions, say coral genus composition, for example. And we apply our analyses, which I'm going to talk more about, our threshold. And in this case, lo and behold, we find that the target community is not really novel with respect to the reference set. So it falls to the left here. And this is fairly theoretical, but I'm going to show you how this works in practice fairly quickly here. So, and lastly, the framework encompasses a number of various properties that the major components might have. And these are the gray positions here in this diagram. They're generally subjective and user-defined. They're unique to each individual study based on such factors as data availability and the hypotheses under consideration. So that's a general framework that we have been applying now to understand ecological novelty. The framework has a number of desirable attributes, and the first being that it's quantitative and repeatable across any ecosystem, any taxon, any temporal or spatial scale. Our early work focused on marine planktonic communities over the past 65 million years. I'll draw upon some of this work later in the talk based on deep sea drilling cores and data on plankton that's held in the Neptune database in Berlin. But we're currently applying the framework to decadal data on coral communities from the Great Barrier Reef. So here's data on community composition over time at 4 different reefs. And we're right now applying our framework to try to understand novelty in this particular situation. So you can see, the applicability over temporal scales. You're going here from decadal timescales to million-year timescales. So the good thing about the framework and the approach is that it's agnostic with respect to timescale. It's equally applicable. And here's a paper that we some work that we recently published, which is a study of novelty from pollen records over the past 25,000 years globally. That's been published last year. Tim was the lead author on that paper. So the framework is applicable over any range of temporal scales as long as time series data exist. Another attribute is that novelty could be anything. It's not just ecological. So instead of, say, species abundances, one can just use variation in climate variables as the dimensions of interest. And then climate novelty can be detected and analyzed. It's adaptable. It can be further developed to accommodate a range of questions surrounding novelty or novel ecosystems. For example, changes in functional attributes of reef coral communities is something I'll talk about a little bit later in the talk. So, and even things like trophic structure or any number of ecological attributes that communities might have. So there's really a broad range of issues that can be dealt with here. Okay, from this generalized framework now, I want to zero in on how we've detected novelty so far in our work, so I can provide you with some examples of some of the ecological insights one might be able to gain through the lens of novelty. Okay, so we're gonna drill down now a little bit into how this novelty detection framework works. So we're gonna look at 2 signals of compositional change: rapid change and change to an unprecedented state. So those are two important components that are going to appear throughout the rest of the talk that you need to be sort of cognizant of. So the signals can be measured individually by computing dissimilarity values along a time series. So the first one is that we evaluate dissimilarity between a target community here and its immediate predecessor. And we call that instantaneous dissimilarity. And that applies to our rapid change component of novelty. The other thing we can do is look at expectations, look at the dissimilarity between a current community and all the other communities preceding that target community. So all communities in that temporal reference set. So using these dissimilarity values, then we can plot them and note the inversion of scale here for cumulative dissimilarity and instantaneous dissimilarity. We can model expectations for ecological change using a GAMS or other spline-based models that are seen here in gray. And so we have a 95% threshold, and against this, we can classify each of our time bin samples or our target communities in the time series as a number of different classifications. So here, the instantaneous novelty is detected at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 places where the instantaneous dissimilarity goes above a certain threshold. And here, similarly, we have 5 cases of cumulative novelty where dissimilarity exceeds the threshold as well. And where we have so we have instantaneous novelty, cumulative novelty in blue, and where the instantaneous novelty, this is a convention that we've been using to define true or actual novel communities, is where instantaneous novelty coincides in the same time bin as instantaneous, as cumulative novelty. And so that's our definition of a novel community. All the other communities shown as gray dots here are just referred to as background communities. And that's where the communities remain within the bounds of normal variation through time. So that's the fundamental building block or analytical approach that we use to detect novelty. Okay, so what are some ecological studies that we've done using this approach and some future directions? First of all, let's look at the frequency of novel communities, and then we'll look at the probability of community state transitions. So for the frequency, we've so far examined the frequency of novelty of communities from 3 ecosystems: Cenozoic marine plankton from the Neptune database over 66 million years with a 100,000-year resolution. Quaternary plant pollen community shown in green over the last 25,000 years with about a 200-year resolution. And then late Holocene coral reefs from cores across about 1,500 years on the Great Barrier Reef with a resolution of about 20 to 50 years shown in orange. We also have some data from freshwater fish communities. And these show a similar sort of range of values. You can see that the time frame of these 3 ecosystems varies, but the frequency of occurrence of novel communities is relatively rare, generally less than 5% or so through time. And similar across marine and terrestrial ecosystems. Now, I mentioned that our latest data is coming from a global database of freshwater fish communities, which is only in the last 50 years, covers the last 50 years, and has a resolution, a seasonal resolution. But the novelty in these freshwater fish communities is now we're looking at about 13%, so 0.13 probability. So that's almost twice as much in the modern freshwater fish communities as we've seen in these past sort of with limited or no human impact communities that I'm displaying here. So there could be something in the in this idea that modern communities are more susceptible to novelty than past communities. But this is the sort of frequency that we tend to deal with. Okay, so let's look now at the probability of community state transitions. Pay attention to these little this little legend here, and basically it shows the transition from a preceding state or a preceding time bin with the arrow going into the succeeding state or the immediately succeeding time bin. So these little symbols show transitions from, say, a novel community to instantaneous, or background community in gray here to a novel, truly novel community. So it just shows community state transitions. And what we've done is we computed the expected probability of transition from the occurrence probabilities and plotted those against the ratio of observed to expected probability to provide an understanding of the expectations and what placing the data in an expected in terms of their expectations. So most observed transitions were from background to background. So over 90% of transitions, as you can imagine, from a 0.05 probability of emergence, that most of the transitions were background to background communities. Transitions between the three types of novelty and background state were much rarer. But many of them occurred less often than expected by chance. So below this, this one here are less often than expected by chance. Above this line is more often than expected by chance. And then transitions from one novelty state to another were rarer still, but led to subsequent novelty from 2 to 10 times more often than expected. So although the transition from one novel state to another was rare, it was quite a bit more probable than expected by chance, okay? So despite this low probability of novelty in these planktonic marine communities, only sort of less than 2% for truly novel communities, the transitions between the instantaneous, cumulative, and novel community states occurred substantially more often than expected. And to us, this demonstrates a heightened propensity for novelty to beget further novelty. So once you have a novel, once you transition into a novel state, then you stand a higher chance of maintaining that novel state or moving into a different novel state. Okay, so let's look now at extrinsic versus intrinsic drivers of novelty. And for the intrinsic drivers, we're going to look at the Neptune marine plankton data again. For extrinsic drivers, we're going to look at the Neotoma data on plant communities. First, we'll discuss the role of taxonomic loss and taxonomic gain as intrinsic drivers of compositional change through time. Taxonomic loss can be either due to local extinction or emigration. And taxonomic gain can be either to local origination or immigration. So again, when we have our symbols here going from a preceding state to a succeeding state, the 4 different kinds of novelty. And we can see here that with taxonomic loss, that is by plotting local extinction against immigration, we see that species turnover is a major feature in the transition to novelty. Species have a 3 to 4 greater probability of going extinct in transitions to truly novel communities up here than in shifts to background communities. So background transitions, the probability of local extinction is quite low, emigration is quite low, but as you go through, as novelty becomes more important in these transitions, then local extinction and immigration become more important. So taxonomic loss is a big component of novelty, of the development of novelty in these communities. But also taxonomic gain is an important component. So transition to novel communities, truly novel communities with about a 5 to 6 greater probability of being then transitions to background communities. So, so species gain in the instantaneous communities is driven more by species recolonization, consistent with instantaneous novelty being a large shift to a state that has occurred before. So where you have just instantaneous, there is no cumulative novelty. So this is the idea of species reappearing in the assemblage after a prior disappearing from the assemblage. But in the case of the development of true novel communities, we have clearly the importance of taxonomic gain much greater than in background transitions. Okay, so these results demonstrate that novel communities have a propensity to cascade through multiple novelty shifts, and each are associated with elevated rates of extinction and origination. But it's the extinction risk, I think, that comes into clear view here that maybe we should think a bit about. Novel communities that transition to background communities, including those that persist, undergo less taxonomic turnover than those that transition to subsequent novel communities. So, you know, when you think about this in terms of a management perspective, then you think that, well, maybe novel communities should be conserved because even though they've moved into this novel state, which might be less desirable than the initial state, in order to arrest that development and their propensity to develop into more novel communities, then they might deserve some consideration to be conserved as they are. So efforts to reduce extinction risk would be consistent with the active management and conservation of these newly emergent novel communities. Okay, so let's have a look at an extrinsic driver of novelty, which is global warming. This example is from the Neotoma plant communities that we looked at earlier over the last 25,000 years or so. And it shows the emergence probability of novel communities through time. And you can see that novelty peaks in the mid-Holocene and also in the modern. Now there's a little bit difference in scale here between A and B. A goes from 25,000 years ago to 1,000 years ago, and then B is a different scale going from 1,000 years to the present. So if we look at temperature records over this time, you can see that trends in ecological novelty are associated with temperature records, with natural novelty in the past increasing with global warming leading up to the Holocene thermal maximum, and then declining during the Holocene thermal maximum as plant communities equilibrated with their new climate regime. And note that novelty in the most recent modern bin is on par with that peak in the Holocene, but has occurred at a much faster rate. This rise in novelty has occurred only in the last 600 years or so, whereas this took thousands of years to develop in the Holocene. So yeah, something to consider. Okay, so the last thing that I want to look at in terms of ecological studies is functional versus taxonomic novelty. And this was a study done by my current PhD student, Emer Cunningham, while she was an honor student. Emer did her honors thesis on looking at this functional versus taxonomic novelty in coral communities from Eastern Australia. So we've been coring coral reefs in the Great Barrier Reef for many years now, and we have a series of cores going up the coastline of Eastern Australia, both in the Great Barrier Reef and also off the coast of Brisbane here in Moreton Bay and further north in Harvey Bay. So we take these reef sediment cores, bang them down through the reef sediment, and generally in leeward sort of settings in inshore reefs of the GBR. We segregate these cores into 5 centimeter time bins, and then we date them using uranium series radiometric age dating. And so with each one of these bins samples, we can segregate the coral fragments into different genera and have some understanding of the sequence through time. Emer also included traits in her data to look at functional traits, which she defined as any trait which impacts fitness via its effects on growth, reproduction, and survival. Things like growth form, correlate with life history, and a bunch of others that she, I think there was a total of 11 traits that she was able to derive from the genera that she observed in these cores. So as I said, the framework is equally applicable to species composition data as it is to species trait data or multiple other kinds of data. So it enabled Emer to sort of compare the emergence probability from a community species composition taxonomic perspective to a community sort of functional trait perspective. And what you see here is that novelty is rare, as we've seen, less than 5% in most ecosystems that we've been dealing with. But functional novelty is rarer than taxonomic novelty, so it's way down here at 1% or less. So when you look at the occurrence of probability of co-occurrence for all novelty classifications, so taxonomic novelty given functional or functional novelty given taxonomic novelty, you can plot these probabilities and draw a center line and where these plots fall down. Here below the line, functional novel communities are also taxonomically novel. Top of the line, above the line, taxonomically novel communities are also functionally novel, and what you find is that almost all the points fall below the line. So most often functional novel communities are also taxonomically novel, and taxonomic novel communities sort of conserve their functional composition. They don't change in their functional composition. Okay, so now I want to go on to a couple of slides on some directions I think this research can take. And believe you me, I can't take all these directions, so happy for others to take these ideas and run with them. And then spend a couple of minutes on some applications. There's so many potential interesting avenues to take, I think, with this work that we feel like we've only really begun to scratch the surface. So, for example, biogeographic studies. Climate change is obviously a large driver of compositional change in communities. For coral reefs, the nature of emerging high latitude refugia can be explored, I think, through analyses of compositional change through time in a novelty context. So, for example, here's Wolfgang Kiesling's reef-based sort of history of the paleolatitudinal distribution of about 3,000 reefs through the past 540 million years. The plot shows times in Earth history when reefs were extended past 20 degrees latitude and when they constricted equatorially. So an analysis of novelty during these times can really provide some insight into how communities change along these latitudinal gradients and biogeographic transitions. And something I've been interested for a long time with changes along the Eastern Australian coastline, particularly during climate change. So how do novelty dynamics play out over these environmental fluctuations? Here, for example, is Adriana Burgess's wonderful demonstration of the incursion of tropical coral communities to high latitude kelp settings along coastal Japan between the 1990s to 2013. You can see these kelp communities were thriving in the 1990s, and as global warming proceeded, they were gradually dying out because the water became too warm, and the corals were invading from the south. And if you look at these communities now, they're almost all they're dominated by corals. So evaluation using the techniques that the approach that we're using, from the standpoint of ecological novelty, I think can provide some early warning signals for impending phase shifts. They can also provide some information on how distinct or novel these emerging coral communities are with respect to those that preceded them, but also to those from other subtropical areas around the globe. And of course, the functional characteristics associated with that. Another avenue is looking at the notion of stability and all its varied components and its relation to biodiversity. I think lends itself to our novelty framework. If we go back to the planktonic communities, in addition to finding these novel communities in those deep sea drilling cores, we also uncovered marine plankton communities that were unexpectedly similar to either their immediately pre-existing community down here, or in comparison with all other communities. So instead of now having outliers, denoting novelty, we have outliers denoting more similar than expected. So do these communities represent resistance to change, or if they've been disturbed, or if there's a disturbance event, resilient communities? What are the taxonomic and functional characteristics of these kind of communities? We haven't even begun to have a look at these kinds of this kind of information yet. The concepts of stability are often evaluated for univariate approaches. So, for example, biomass. But in fact, we can do this with this sort of thing with compositional change through time using a multivariate approach. We can test for novelty in community trophic structure and climate and biotic interactions, or any other ecologically or biologically meaningful investigation. These studies can also incorporate legacy effects in a novelty context. What components of the novel community persist, and why, and what attributes do they have? These are all interesting questions that are really important for managers today on the ground who are trying to understand what a novel community is and trying to predict, what kind, trying to predict how they're going to fare in the face of environmental change, and how to conserve them. Okay, so the last couple of minutes, then I think I'll just turn our attention to how the analysis of ecological novelty derived from time series data can be applied to real world environmental challenges. We'll look at local and regional natural resource management applications first, and then we'll go on to global biodiversity indicators. And this could involve the development of local bioindicators for natural resource management can involve multiple governance scales, from traditional owners to local councils, to regional natural resource managers, to state and federal management agencies. In Australia, we have such agencies as Landcare Australia, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, Queensland Department of Environment in science and local Aboriginal elders councils that are all interested in trying to understand and place their ecosystem current condition into a past perspective. So, you know, they all want to know what, or want to, we'd like to supply them or with robust indicators for tracking ecological change through time. Okay, so if you're a manager, you might want to compare how much the monitoring sites, the sites that you're monitoring, have changed from their historical states on a standardized scale across your management area. So you can apply our framework and come out with fit for purpose quantitative indicators. And the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority has already tapped us on the shoulder for trying to develop these indicators for the condition and the novelness of emerging communities on the Great Barrier Reef, for example. But let me give you an example, a couple of hypothetical examples. These are hypothetical. This is not real data, but I'm just going to show you how potentially this could be used. So here is a forest in Queensland, in central Queensland, that's divided into 9 subregions. And so what you can do is you can look at the community composition today with within each region with those of the past, say, you know, 10, 20 or 30-year time series. And let's say you do that, and for these are our two measures of novelty: instantaneous novelty, fast, rapid change, and cumulative novelty, the blue and the red shown there. And these values then provide an assessment for each subregion. So there's been instantaneous novelty in region 1 that shows rapid change. There's been not much change at all in region 2, potentially resilient, et cetera, et cetera. So you can, for each one of these subregions, you can apply the framework and come up with whether novelty is occurring or not. Let's look at region 5 here, where we have a novel state. Well, remember, this novelty framework can be applied not only to community composition data, but also to other data like climate conditions and human use. And we can see that the novel state in subregion 5 is mostly due to changes in human use. So, for example, maybe cattle grazing in that particular area of the state forest. So it's a really nice, powerful tool that you can use even to determine the likely processes or drivers of novelty. Here's another didactic, totally hypothetical example from Great Barrier Reef communities. We can consider the 2023, maybe 2,000 reefs from the Great Barrier Reef in 2023, you know, if we had the data. And most of those, when we compare that to a time series going back, we see that most of the communities are background communities, but there's been rapid change and novel states in a lower percentage of these sites. So you can then make a plot through time of the proportion of Great Barrier Reefs in a novel state. And you can see in 2023, it's about 0.04 in our hypothetical example. And then one can compare that state with other places around the world. So you can see here's our 2023 value of Australia of 0.04. And then we can compare that to the Philippines, PNG, Mexico, USA, la-di-da, right? And place this in some kind of context, the novelty. And so you can see that this would sort of transition into the application of these kinds of metrics into global biodiversity indicators. And that's what I'm showing here. The future goal is to develop biodiversity indicators based on ecological novelty that will directly address international goals and targets. And this includes the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development through their Sustainable Development Goals, the Aichi targets, and then what's replacing the Aichi targets is the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So currently nations report standardized biodiversity status against a large number of indicators. administered through the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership. But currently, there's really no globally accepted indicator for rigorously identifying novel or resilient ecosystems or sites based on historical changes in community composition, even though such data is globally widespread. There's a lot of data out there, that time series data, that people can be using to develop this indicator. So we see tremendous value in incorporating our novelty work into the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership to complement some of the existing BIP indicators, like the Living Planet Index, the Biodiversity Intactness Index, Ocean Health Index, et cetera, et cetera. So in these indicators and others that are part of the BIP, the role of time series data on species composition is either absent, confined to single taxonomic groups, or underutilized. And I think this is arguably due to the absence of a rigorous and standardized approach to measure ecological changes in species composition through time. And I think this is a gap that we're now filling with our novelty framework. Okay, so to conclude, I'm just going to tell you what I just told you. A general framework for ecological novelty allows a much needed standardized approach for detection and analysis. Past ecological novelty is relatively rare in the absence of human impacts, providing an important baseline for more recent response to anthropogenically degraded ecosystems. The development of novel communities facilitates the development of more novel communities, that is, novelty begets novelty. This, coupled with high extinction rates that accompany ecological novelty, means that conservation measures should consider actions that arrest further degradation in newly emerged novel communities. And the relationship between taxonomic novelty and functional novelty is lopsided. Further investigation into the triggers for functional change in ecological communities is warranted. New directions in comparative ecology are facilitated by the novelty framework, with excellent potential for enhanced understanding of ecological processes derived from time series data. And lastly, the ability to analyze ecological change through time means that ecosystem integrity can be evaluated on multiple spatial, temporal, and governmental scales, from local NRMs to the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership that provides global indicators for international reporting on ecosystem targets. So I know that's a lot of information. Thank you very much. And I'm quite happy to take any questions and even hang around afterwards if you want to have a chat.
Thanks, John. That was great. Let me see here. So do we have any questions in the chat? We have nothing. Does anybody have a question for John? We can open up the floor. Just raise your hand. I have a question, John.
Oh, good.
So you talked a bit about the lopsidedness of novelty in a functional and a taxonomic context. That makes sense, at least from a perspective of somebody that like snorkels on a reef or walks through a forest, right? Makes sense.
Yeah.
But do you think that the extent of lopsidedness could be something that could be used for the kind of questions that the applications that you're talking about, in terms of, is it really worthwhile investing money in protecting this, or is it shot, or is it changed, or is it something completely different, or what is this system, and how with this historical context, which, by the way, this is great. This is your work is amazing, because it really reinvigorates the use of historical data, I think. So just interested in that lopsidedness.
Yeah, no, thanks, Aaron. I think you're right. I think the extent of lopsidedness would be a more interesting question than whether it's there or not. What I fear is is making that comparative across ecosystems, because I think you'd have to confine that kind of analysis to within ecosystems, because of the functionality, is going to be so it's going to be typical of each ecosystem. It's not going to apply across ecosystems. But I hadn't thought about the degree of lopsidedness before, and I think that's a really good point. That's worth going back and having a look at again within a particular ecosystem, to see if there's any insights that could be gained from that. I think there would be, when we think about coral reefs and the dominance of branching corals in both the Caribbean and the Indo-Pacific, or in their well, none of us have seen this, but in their pristine state, many years ago, when they were dominated by branching corals, that functional change is going to occur a lot sooner with the loss of biodiversity in the Caribbean than in the Indo-Pacific. So those patterns are going to be quite important from a within ecosystem perspective. Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Interesting. Any questions for John? Out of interest, John, I mean, you could take this back to the Ediacaran, right? Well,
sure.
It'd be really,
take it wherever you like.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, that was something that we sort of kind of fell out of the we just went back. I had this great week with Wolfgang and Tim, developing this thing. We took off to, we went to Germany in 2018, Tim and I, and we just had this wonderful week of, okay, well, let's pretend that we are on a spaceship. We go to the Miocene. How the hell are we going to measure novelty? And it was one of the funnest weeks I've ever had, in my research career, because we just started off with a pencil and paper on the back of an envelope, and and as it turns out, it was just one of the properties that came out of this approach was that, hey, we could apply this to seasonal variation in plant communities as easily as we can to the million-year scale changes in foreign communities. So it was really a nice emergent property of the approach that we were very satisfied with.
That's great. Can I ask one more question before we go, John? Just
sure.
Predictions. You talked about using this approach for predictions. Is that essentially based on the speed aspect of the quantification of speed, or is that something? Is there something else I'm missing there?
No, I think the speed is going to be defined from the rate of environmental change, right? If you're thinking about compositional, I think the predictions come more into, what are the attributes of these novel ecosystems in the past? So are they likely to remain their composition that they are in the novel state, in which case they become a background community, if you can get your head around that? Yeah. Or are they more likely to change to another novel system? And I think by going into the past and looking at these ecosystems and what's driving these communities, what are the functional changes, what are the taxonomic changes, then we can start to predict what might happen to background communities today as they transition to novel communities, and novel communities today as they transition into T+1 communities. Right, so it's a question of looking in the past and trying to derive attributes of naturally formed novel communities to give us some predictive capacity for understanding what might happen with modern day novel communities.
And the additional finding that of novelty begetting novelty, of course, it's the slippery slope, right?
It is. I mean, it's really interesting because there's this major debate about novel communities. I don't know if you've caught, among the conservation ecologists, Dan Simberloff has weighed in. It's like, and the original people like Hobbes, who were editors of that book that I showed early in the talk, and other people think that, okay, we've got these novel ecosystems, we can't make them go away. Let's adapt our conservation approaches to those, and then people like Simberloff and some other people who said, no, you're throwing in the towel. These novel communities are bad. We need to conserve. Make sure this doesn't happen. La-di-da. But I think these results sort of throw an interesting wrench into the mix, because it's like, okay, well, obviously we don't want to, not conserve these non-novel communities, but I think this work shows that we really do need to put some effort into conserving these novel communities, lest, as you say, we continue down this slippery slope to slime, where one novel community is turning into another, with biodiversity loss occurring at each one of those intervals, right? So, I think that idea of novelty begetting novelty demands some attention by conservationists.
Right. Of course, it depends on what your ultimate goal is, and if you want to save biodiversity or function, which is the lopsided thing again, we can get back to that.
That's true. Yeah, you might still have your functions, and so you might not care what your biodiversity changes.
Right. Exactly, and that may be true for people that are fishing on a reef, and that functionally the fish are still there. Maybe.
Absolutely, and it's true for people like David Bellwood as well. He thinks, well, as long as the function's there, we've got a reef, sort of thing. It's fine.
Right.
And
right.
This infatuation with biodiversity is potentially a human construct. I don't agree with that, but it's one point of view.
It is all well, there is something intrinsic to biodiversity. It's been around for a long time.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, thanks, John, so much. That was great. It was just wonderful to have you give our last Q-MARE seminar.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you to you, John, and also to everyone that gave a seminar before. It's been really fun. Thanks for joining and tuning in. Bye. I'll stop recording now.
Bye-bye, everybody.